And then it's always sort of start trying to think about how to talk about these things, and praying and hoping that something will open up. So discerning God's providence, a reflection on the global situation in 2024, and I'm grateful that Kieran said it's largely about international affairs and these kind of problems. I thought, great, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. So, first of all, discerning God's providence. So, first of all, we need to think about, well, how ought things to be? How should things be? What should things be like? And a good place to start that here is looking at the flood, where God tried to start everything all over again. And this is a new start, a new beginning. And then after the flood, then it was announced about Noah and his wife. Anybody remember what his wife was called?
Naamah.
Naamah or Naamah, yeah. Not quite sure how to pronounce it. Naamah. Anyway, they had 3 sons, and this is what it was said about them. The sons of Japheth, from these, the maritime people spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. These are sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations, and again there's a long list. And these are sons of Shem by their clans and languages in their territories and nations, again a long list of all these people and their descendants. So these are clans of Noah's sons according to the lines of descent within their nations, and from these nations spread out all over the whole world after the flood. So here we have this vision of a plurality of nationalities, a plurality of languages, and a plurality of cultures. And when Rabbi Jonathan Sachs added them all up, it came to 70. Oh, that's interesting. 70 different ones. And so that was, in that sense, very much the vision. There should be this plurality and diversity of nations, languages, and cultures, so people could listen and learn from each other. Because with every language you have, it's just a way of looking at and interpreting the world in which one lives. And if you get to speak, I'm English, so I don't speak English. But some of you here can speak more than one language. And if you're thinking in one language, you look at the world in one way. If you're thinking in another language, you look at the world in another way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yes, that's the way it is, isn't it? Yeah, and the more languages you have, the more ways in which you can see the world, and you can make sense of the world, and the more different ways in which you can relate to other people. Yeah, and so actually the world is much richer when there's this plurality of languages and cultures and what do you call these things? Cuisines, etc., and art and everything. The world is much richer when it's like that. And I think that's the kind of world which God wanted. So why? So people need, why should there be lots of different nations and lands? So people need a land, a home, a location in space, where a nation can shape its own destiny in accord with its deepest aspirations and ideals. And different nations have different aspirations and ideals, different kinds of customs, different kinds of traditions, and different laws and languages. And this is very much the Old Testament vision. So when God, the Mosaic law was when God gave the people of Israel the promised land, there were clear borders. Yeah? It wasn't, you should expand and conquer the entire world, but there are clear borders. This is your eastern border, this is your northern border, this is your western border, this is your southern border. It varied, but it's very, very clear there were clear borders. Every nation should live within its own territory, within its own land, and not try to invade and occupy other lands, other territories, creating empires. And so while at the same time respecting strangers and foreigners. That's also very interesting. So as it says in Ezekiel, you must share this land among yourselves, talking to different tribes, so that each tribe of Israel receives a part. Each part you receive will belong to you and to the foreigners who live among you, whom you have to treat with respect and according to the law. So that's very interesting. It's not that it should be homogeneous and not allow any refugees or foreigners, but that they should fit in within that kind of space. And so when we turn to the principle then, it emphasizes this and takes this up. Human history is a history of the providence of restoration. So if we're thinking about what God's dispensation is, this is what it is according to the principle. Battles over property, territory, and people have continued without interruption, expanding their scope in step with the progress of human society. The scale of these struggles has broadened from the family level to the levels of tribe, society, nation and world, until today, when the democratic world and the communist world confront each other in a final conflict. We all wish that had been the case. A bit out of date now. In these last days of human history, heavenly laws descended upon the earth in the name of democracy. It's really important, very significant. They're not dictatorship, but democracy, that people should have a say in how their country is run and governed. Bringing an end to the long phase of history in which people sought to obtain happiness by seizing property, land and people. That's what empires are. You think, oh, I want that piece of land that those people have got, and I want those people, and I want to control those people, and the only way in which I can do that is I have to make them adopt our laws, our customs, our languages, and everything else. And so it's often the way it has been. Just look at British history. Anybody from Scotland here? Yeah? How do the Scots feel about the imposition of English law? And, well, English law was never imposed or even Scots law, but language though. Yeah, and trying to impose the Church of England didn't go down very well either, with it. No, big mistake. Okay, so conclusion of World War I, the defeated nations gave up their colonies. At the end of World War II, the victors voluntarily liberated their colonies, providing them with material aid. So this is the vision, that all these empires that people have developed and built should actually be broken up so every nation should be independent and self-governing. In recent years, this great powers have invited weak and tiny nations, some smaller than one of their own cities, to become member states of the United Nations, giving them equal rights and status in the Brotherhood of Nations. So that's the vision which was there at the time after the flood with Noah. All these different nations living at peace with each other and respecting each other. And this is the vision which is articulated here very clearly in the principal vision of God's providence and how it should be developing. So when we look over the past year, we should be thinking about, okay, this is what God's providence is supposed to be like. How has that been going on? So some of the breakup of empires. This is the old British Empire, in which Mike and I were born into, and a long time ago, but it doesn't exist anymore. Just a few islands which are still left. Then there's after the First World War, the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. These countries in Eastern Europe. Still not always resolved in what later became Yugoslavia. Also the division of the Ottoman Empire, which was up here. A whole of this area here, plus the whole of North Africa as part of the Ottoman Empire, governed from somewhere over here, I can't remember where it was, somewhere like that. And which also occupied a large part of Eastern Europe as well. But after the First World War, that was broken up, because if you're on the losing side, whether you like it or not, you get broken up and chopped up into different parts. And so the Ottoman Empire then was also broken up into Egypt, what later became known as Jordan, Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Turkey. Main people, and Armenia didn't start off like that. They fought for independence. They became an independent country as well. The only country that really suffered the worst was Kyrgyzstan. The Kurdish people, huge number, about 50, 60 million people over here, yeah, never managed to get to the Treaty to Versailles and never managed to get their own country. And so that problem is continuing today in the conflict we get with Turkey. And so what's going on today, this problem going on here, you can see that Turkey is sort of trying to move back and to occupy that kind of space which the Ottoman Empire occupied. The Chinese Empire, I don't know much about Chinese history, but that was China. And then Qing dynasty when it came along, and took Taiwan in 1683, and the lot of Han Chinese, some Han Chinese started moving there. Mongolia, then Tibet, then Xinjiang, just here, which is where the Uyghurs are today. And then along with that then came this Sinicization, which means trying to make the whole empire more and more Chinese. So spread of the Han people. So for example, Manchuria, the Manchus were there. Then a lot of Han Chinese have moved in there, so now predominantly Han Chinese. And also the same thing's happening now in Tibet and Xinjiang as well. And so along with that comes the language, the culture and the politics to try to turn this empire into a state, basically. And yeah, so Taiwan was part of China for quite a while. Then, these borders became governed by Japan for a while after that war didn't work out. So if you look at Russia, this is Russia in the 17th century, mid-17th century. You can see there was no warm sea port. The only port they have is Archangel, which is in the Arctic. Yeah, it's frozen most of the time. And this here is Sweden, which is an empire. And then Russia was kind of locked into that kind of area there, no warm sea port. Anyway, so Peter the Great, who travelled around Europe, picked up lots of military stuff from Europe, he realised what we need to do is we need to get a warm sea port. So he fought against Sweden, defeated the Swedes, and then Russia took over this area here, established what became known as St. Petersburg, named after him. And then a bit later, Catherine the Great did what Peter said, and he got to move south and conquer Crimea. So you can have a warm sea port down there. And you can see here, Poland at that stage is a huge country within Europe. And so Russia then is expanding with trade and lots of other ways. And then the Russian Empire here expanded even further. So where's Poland? Poland disappeared. Became occupied by Russia. And so this then became what's known as the Russian Empire. All this area here, which was part of the Ottoman Empire, this was all part of the Ottoman Empire before. Then the Ottomans were pushed out of Eastern Europe there. And they were pushed out of this area here. Russia took over this area here. And then in 1914, there was a war, First World War, which Russia lost. And then it was taken over by the communists, and they decided communism is basically very critical of imperialism. They regarded imperialism as the highest danger of capitalism. So the communists had a problem. We've now taken over the Russian Empire. What are we going to do? Well, we need to break it up because we're anti-imperialists. So what should they do? Well, Stalin then, who's a Georgian, he was appointed to be in charge of all these different nationalities, what to do with all these different nationalities within the Russian Empire. So he defined a nation, quite accurately I would say, as historically constituted, stable community of people formed on the basis of a common language, territory, economic life, and psychological makeup manifested in a common culture. I think that's a good, accurate description. And so he started drawing the lines, breaking up the empire. But then some nations, like Ukraine, they had their own language, their own culture. They never had their own country before, but now they started to want to have their own country and become independent, even though they were socialists and communists. And so there's a possibility here of the fragmentation of everything and the breakup. And so what Stalin did is he drew the lines so that all these different new states weren't actually homogeneous, just one ethnic group in there, but they were mixed. So there was this instability within the country. So Ukraine, for example, is half of the Ukrainians are Russian speakers and half Ukrainian speakers, almost like a civil war. Then the same in Georgia, the same sort of situation. And so he created a new union of Soviet socialist republics, and these boundaries changed. After 1945, this was what the Soviet Union was like, lots of these Soviet socialist states, all parts of what was the Russian Empire. And then after 1991, you had the breakup of the Soviet Union. And up until that time, Russia had been part, Crimea, which is down here somewhere, there it is, had been part of Russia. And since Catherine the Great, it remained part of Russia during the Soviet period, early Soviet period, up until 1954, when Secretary General Khrushchev, who was equivalent to a president of the Soviet Union, decided to transfer and give it to Ukraine. So Crimea then was donated to the Ukraine. So when the Soviet Union broke up then, Crimea was now part of Ukraine, and you got these other new countries appeared, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, which are all what the Georgia down here, what was the old Soviet Union. The borders stayed the same. But then if you look at what's the situation in Ukraine, because of the lines that Stalin drew, just like when Africa was divided up by former colonial powers, also straight lines were drawn here and here, and tribes are divided, and it was very problematic. So in Ukraine it's the same. These are all Ukrainians who are Ukrainian speakers, ethnically Ukrainian speakers. These are ethnically Ukrainian but Russian speakers. These people over here are all Russian, ethnically Russian speakers. And also these people here are all ethnically Russian speakers. They were Crimean Tatars, but Stalin deported them. And so that's a reality in Ukraine. It's a divided country between two different peoples. So this is the history of Crimea. It was part of Byzantium, which is the Eastern Roman Empire. There it is. Then the Mongols came along from Mongolia. They conquered the whole of Russia, and that caused a huge number of problems because part of the Slavic people became under Mongol domination, but a large part didn't. They later developed the Ukrainian sense of identity. Then you had the Crimean Khanate here, which again is Muslim. Then the Russian Empire came along, and it was part of Russia for that period of time. Then it's part of the Soviet Union, and then it's transferred to Ukraine. And then in 2014, Russia decided to annex Ukraine. So why did it do that? Well, basically because historically Crimea was part of Russia for 200 years. What's that? It's all right. Thanks, Helena. And so Russia, Crimea was part of Russia for 200 years. People there were Russians. They self-identified as being Russians, not as being Ukrainians. And so Crimea is also where the chief main Sevastopol, the Russia's main warm sea port, was, and the base of its Black Sea fleet. So when Ukraine became independent, Russia then leased its naval bases from Ukraine. And Russia thought, well, Ukraine is part of the former Soviet Union, they're still going to be allied with us, they're still going to be on our side, and so from the Russian point of view, that was okay. It was digestible. Not that they were happy with it, but it was doable. But then there came a lot of political conflict and turmoil within Ukraine. So a pro-Moscow person, Viktor Yanukovych, he rigged the election and he won the election. So Moscow wanted a pro-Russian president, and so the election's rigged and he was elected. And then he was overthrown because lots of Ukrainians weren't happy about that by what's called the Orange Revolution. There were new elections, won by someone called Viktor Yushchenko, and he was Western orientated, and he wanted the Ukraine to join NATO. 2008 applied to join NATO. Then this person here, Yanukovych, he won the next election, but that was, and he rejected this idea of forming a relationship with the EU and NATO. He decided to have closer ties with Russia. And then there was another Euromaidan protest where he was overthrown and he fled and left the country. So you can see here the country is very divided. Almost half the country is pro-Moscow and the other half of the country is pro-EU. So what should a country do when it's in that situation? What? What should it do?
Have a referendum. Separate and up to countries.
Better just to be independent, not on one side or the other. If you choose one side, you alienate half the population. You choose the other side, you alienate the other half. They should have remained an independent country. Big problem was that. And you might wonder, so from a Russian point of view, the idea here of the Ukraine joining the EU and joining NATO was strategically totally and utterly unacceptable. First of all, Crimea always belonged to Russia, it's Russian, and also that's their main warm sea port, where they do trade, where they have their navy, etc., etc. It's unacceptable for them to lose Crimea. If Ukraine remained independent, that would be acceptable. But as soon as Ukraine wants to join NATO and the EU, from a Russian point of view, that means that the Crimea is going to be part of NATO. That means our naval base is going to be under NATO control, which means we're going to lose control of our main naval base and our trade. From a Russian point of view, that is totally unacceptable. and they're legitimately unacceptable, because Crimea was always part of Russia. The problem was, when the Soviet Union broke up, then Crimea should have been given back to Russia. The problem was, in my opinion, the president of Russia at that time was Boris Yeltsin, and he drank too much. He was drunk half the time. He didn't do the things which he should have done. Anyway, so there's a reason for that, is that Russia then invaded the Crimea. Very shockingly, it invaded the Crimea, it held a referendum in the Crimea. The people in the Crimea voted to stay with Russia, completely understandably. The big problem then is that Russia shouldn't have done that. What Russia should have done, it should have gone to the United Nations and said to the United Nations, look, for 200 years, Crimea is part of Russia. All the people living in the Crimea, they want to be part of Russia. The only reason why it became part of the Ukraine is because Khrushchev did this little deal, basically. And we should have get the Crimea back. And if Russia had articulated, expressed its views to the United Nations Security Council, I'm sure they could have had a debate and explained to the idiots living in the West, Washington and Brussels and London, Russia has a legitimate right to have Crimea back. But they didn't do that, just invaded and stayed. Okay. So what should have happened? Well, as I said, Crimea should have been returned to Russia. There should have been a referendum held in Russia, speaking Donbass region, which is the eastern region. So Solzhenitsyn worked it all out. He was half Ukrainian himself, and he spent a lot of time in the Gulag, where he met lots of other Ukrainians, people of all nationalities. He realized there's a real problem here because of the lines that Stalin had drawn. So he said, if one day the Soviet Union should break up, what should happen is that eastern Ukraine, they should have a referendum about whether they want to stay within the Ukraine or if they want to go back to Russia. But because everything was done so quickly when the Soviet Union broke up, nobody really thought it through. It just broke up very, very quickly. Whereas if they really thought it through clearly and had a clear plan, that's what they could have done and they should have done. Yeah,
Can Russia reverse that?
Sorry?
Can Russia reverse that?
Reverse what?
Reverse the attack and go into communicating to or with
They won't.
the United Nations?
They won't.
They won't.
No, it's not the
But they
Russian.
don't have you as their advisor.
They don't have what?
So, they don't have you as their advisor.
No, unfortunately not. I was there for a while, but unfortunately I didn't manage to get into that position.
Well, you should. So.
I should have done, you're quite right, my mistake. Seriously, my mistake. Yeah, I should have. Anyway, I was going to go to Russia in the mid-80s, yeah. Okay, so Ukraine then should be an independent nation, not a part of Russia, the EU or NATO. This is really significant and important. God's providence, independent nations, not one nation being dominated by another nation. Anyway, so what went wrong? I would say the fatal decision was made here, a huge mistake by the West, based partly upon complete and utter ignorance about Russian history, about Russian culture, about the way the world works, about strategy, and all sorts of things. So, you know, George W. Bush's father was a wise man. George W. Bush was not. He persuaded his allies, which is us, to open NATO's door to Ukraine and Georgia over vehement Russian objections. So as it said in this meeting they had in, I can't remember what it was now, NATO welcomes Ukraine's and Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations for membership in NATO. We agree today that these countries will become members of NATO, the leader said in a statement. Russian President Putin, who was at the summit, described this as a direct threat to Russian security. Direct threat to Russian security. But people weren't listening, and he didn't explain it very clearly. He didn't explain about Russian history and Russian concern and this and this and this, which he should have done. Yeah, so both sides were completely ignorant about the other side. Nobody was studying and listening to the other side and understanding the other side's history and the concerns. Anyway, 4 months later then, Russia invaded Georgia. Yeah. The idea that Georgia is not just nowhere near Europe or NATO or the Atlantic should suddenly join the EU and NATO is completely off the scale. So Russia took advantage of where Stalin had created Georgia and occupied part of it, the Russian-speaking part. Some experts describe the decision in Bucharest as a massive error that left Russia feeling cornered by a seemingly overexpanding NATO. NATO counters that it doesn't press down countries into joining. But the reality is that when all these negotiations are taking place with Yeltsin, the West promised not to expand NATO, not to move NATO east. And the people who did this were the first George Bush, people like Kohl, President of Germany, Mitterrand, the President of France, Mrs. Thatcher, the NATO leader of the time. These are wise people who understood. The next generation were not wise. Yeah, they were neoconservatives. So Ukraine then tried to make Russian speakers, and then that's one problem. The other problem was created by Ukrainians themselves. So half of Ukraine is Russian-speaking, but the Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians wanted the whole country to speak the same language, Ukrainian. So they started trying to make the Eastern Republic, the Donbass area, teach Ukrainian in schools and make that a Ukrainian language as well. Make the Ukrainian language the dominant language in the East as well. From the point of view of ordinary Russians who are living there, the Russians who spoke Russian, they were Russians ethnically. This is unacceptable. What right do the Ukrainians have to make our children become Ukrainians like them and speak Ukrainian at school and only learn Ukrainian at school? It doesn't work. Yeah, we tried it a few times. It's not a good way.
It's like Wales though, because Wales, they teach them to do whatever you just speak Welsh. But actually a lot of people want to learn Welsh and they've got the signs and everything, so.
It's all you look at British history, it's all kind of complications. You've got the Irish and the Irish language, Gaelic, you've got Scotland and Scottish language, Scots and also Gaelic, you've got the Welsh, and you've got Cornish, which is hardly almost disappeared now. If you look at these things, it's really complicated, it leaves a lot of hurt. Yeah? And you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's what they wanted to do. Anyway, so Russia then intervened in the east to prevent this from taking place. And I said Ukraine wanted to join that. And so this is the expansion of NATO, which was against what the Western leaders promised. It expanded here, Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland. A few years later, all these countries in Eastern Europe, then these countries as well, and wanted Ukraine to join as well. So from a Russian point of view, it's like Russia feels enclosed. It feels, the border with its enemy is on its border. So what should happen? Well, I think, in my opinion, Crimea should remain part of Russia. There's no way that Ukraine is ever going to defeat Russia. It's just never going to happen. Militarily, it's never going to happen. So the best thing to do is for Ukraine to acknowledge, yes, historically, Crimea belongs to Russia, and we're willing to allow Crimea to go back to remain with Russia as they voted in the referendum. And then they said, okay, no way is Ukraine going to drive Russia out of this Ukraine. So what should happen? Well, they should do what Solzhenitsyn recommended, have a referendum. Just as they had a referendum in Crimea, and let the people living there decide which country they want to belong to. Now we do that every now and then, we let Scots have a vote. They still want to stay in the UK. Painful though, isn't it, when you go through these kind of elections? It's really painful. It's a little pain in trying to leave the EU.
William, may I?
Yeah.
Why is Ukraine so that they have to? Do they want to invade Russia and say why is Ukraine fighting?
Ukraine is fighting because they want to be an independent nation.
Okay.
So the Russian view, not just Putin's view, the Russian view generally, is that map of the Russian Empire, they see that was Russia. And so Putin said the Bolshevik Revolution was a disaster because it broke Russia up into all these separate states. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, which he also regards as a disaster, all these separate states became independent. Which from his point of view and the Russian point of view is a disaster. So Russians see, for historical reasons, Russians see Ukraine as Russia, part of Russia. They didn't realize that Ukrainians don't see themselves as being Russians. And there are various reasons, because Ukraine has its own language and different Christian denominations, for various historical reasons, because the Mongols didn't occupy the whole of that area. They developed very much under the influence of Poland. And so there's this Ukrainian sense of independent of self-identity, which is they are not Russians. So Russia never realized that. And Ukraine never existed before as a state or country. It's never existed until 1919, when the Soviet Union was formed. It never existed, so Russians didn't see it as that. And then the way Stalin drew it, powerful people living there, ethnically Russian speakers anyway. But Ukrainians, they just want to have their own country now, and their own land, and they're willing to fight for it. And if you want to be an independent nation, you have to be willing to fight and die for that, to be honest. You can't expect someone to hand it to you on a platter. You know, as a result of what the Ukrainians are doing, their dislike and hatred of Russia has reached phenomenal levels, which never existed before. Yeah, and there's no way they're ever going to allow Russia to conquer the whole of Ukraine and to be humiliated and subdued by Russia. Not going to happen. So both sides need to recognize that. So the European nations then, so need to make, eventually, now that Trump has come along, it's possible you get some kind of sensible deal. The idea you can drive up, it was like at the end of the Second World War, people said, oh, we should have carried on driven the Soviet Union out of East Germany. No way was there ever a possibility. It can't happen. There's no way is it possible for NATO to drive Russia out of Ukraine without leading to a nuclear war. Yeah? They have to settle these things. Okay, you lose the war, you lose land. Yeah? Germany, is it as big as it used to be in the beginning of the 20th century?
No,
Yes, no.
definitely not, no.
You fight a war and you lose, you get smaller. And you fight another war and you lose, you get even smaller. That's the way the world works. The idea, it's like you're going to a casino. You put your bet down and you lose your money. You say, well, can I have the money back so I can bet again? You throw the dice and you lose, you lose. You declare war on someone, you lose land. That's just the way the world works. If you're not willing to accept that, that's the problem. Yeah? You have to say, okay, we went to war, we tried to win, we lost. We can't say, well, we want our land back. Thank you very much. Please go away. You can't do that. This is real politics. This is the way the world really works. And it can only work in this way. When people have sort of ideals, got to drive, the Russians have to go out. That's just ridiculous to think like that. And unfortunately, our governments are run by lots of ridiculous people. So there needs to be a huge change of self-understanding on all sides. The Ukrainians need to understand things. Why the Russians want Crimea back. The Russians need to understand why the Ukrainians want to be an independent nation, which they've never been before, and they're willing to die for that. People need to change their understanding of who they are and understanding who other people are, which means listening to each other. But very rarely does that ever happen. Yeah? You need to listen to each other. Okay, you're right about this, this, and this, and this, but wrong about that. We're right about this, and this, and this, but we're wrong about that. Let's find a compromise. The only reason why there's peace in Europe is because that country compromised after the First and Second World Wars. You've got to compromise. Otherwise, you just end up fighting all over again. Anyway, similar things have been going on here. Then look at the principle. If there were no wars or divisions in this fallen world, then sovereignty of evil will continue forever, and the world will never be restored. That's the principal view. War is inevitable if you're going to change and make the world a better place. Therefore, God has worked His providence to restore the heavenly sovereignty by degrees. God established higher standards of goodness, which come to oppose and destroy regimes with lower standards of goodness. To fulfill the providence of restoration, therefore, conflicts and wars are unavoidable. Anyway, we have the Universal Peace Federation. We ought to be involved much more, in my opinion, in what's going on in Russia and Ukraine. If we understood things better, we would have been able to read the signs. Yeah? Like Father read the signs. And that's why I call the conference in Geneva about what's going to happen, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Father read the signs. Unfortunately, our movement is incapable of reading the signs anymore for some reason. We should have been able to anticipate those things and have events and conferences about these issues. Anyway, the principle says wars conducted by a good sovereignty to destroy an evil sovereignty are good, in that they further the fulfillment of the providence of restoration. So what's the difference between good and evil sovereignty? Good sovereignty one based upon the three blessings: freedom, religion, worship God how you want to worship God. Along with that comes freedom of speech, the rule of law, so you have justice, criminals go to prison and not innocent people. You have democracy, where you can be involved in deciding who's going to run your country. You have property ownership, and you have a free market, so you can buy and sell whatever you want to, whoever you want to. Evil sovereignty, there's no freedom of religion. Most of history, most countries, that's the way it's been. And is it still today in many countries. There's arbitrary rule. Oh, I belong to the Communist Party, therefore I can decide this. Arbitrary rule. Not following the law, but just dictatorship. Religious or secular dictatorship, they're all, both of them wrong. And then you get the state ownership of land. And you can see that happening in this country now more and more, the abolition of independent education and independent schools, which have been independent charities since the Elizabethan times. The state trying to take over more and more of the land, farms, over more and more of the schools, education, take over more and more of everything, including what's taught there. And so you end up with organised criminal gangs or state-controlled economy, and we can see a lot of that going on as well. That's the evil sovereignty. So when we look at what's going on in Israel compared to the countries around it, we could say that Israel has a better sovereignty than Palestine or any Muslim country. Every Muslim country falls into that category. Obviously there's a spectrum, but basically no freedom of religion in any Muslim countries, and all kinds of problems, different kinds of democracy. So how did Israel come into existence then? Well, following the breakup of the Ottoman Empire, I mentioned, the League of Nations in 1919 gave Britain a mandate to create a Jewish homeland. So that was the international community said the Jewish people should have a homeland. We're going to break up the Ottoman Empire. We're going to give this little slither of land at the end of the Mediterranean. This little slither of land is about as big as Wales. It's microscopic compared to all the Muslim Arab countries. And 1947, United Nations voted to do it. The Jews didn't invade the country. There was no military invasion or anything like that. It was the international community who made this decision. And so one needs to respect it. The Arab leadership, unfortunately, in and out of Palestine, rejected the plan. Israel was invaded by 5 Arab armies. What they should have done is they should have accepted the UN proposal. If you're going to be a member of the UN, you have to accept the proposals. Otherwise, you shouldn't be a member of the UN. Personally, I don't think any country should be allowed to join the UN unless they are democracy. Anyway, after this Second World War, there was an armistice when it was fight, and Israel expanded in terms of the land it occupied compared to what United Nations wanted to give it. The West Bank then was annexed by Jordan in 1950, became part of Jordan, and Gaza remained part of Egypt. So historically, Gaza was part of Egypt. It was never part of Israel. Never. The West Bank was never part of Israel. It was part of Jordan. Yeah? So what should have happened, in my opinion, if Arabs and Palestinians, if Arabs really wanted there to be a Palestinian state, at that time, Egypt, they could have done it if they wanted to do it, but they didn't want to do it. They could have done it, but they didn't want to. So what happened after? So let's think about this whole refugee problem. After the Second World War, the largest population movement in European history. Most people living in Europe today know nothing whatsoever about this, unless they happen to be in their 90s. According to the official West German, this is just a little fraction of what was going on. According to the official West German accounts, at least 610,000 expulsions. They're expelled from all the lands, like the Czech Republic, from Poland, from all these different countries, which they've been living for centuries. They were expelled from there. And over 600,000 just died during that process of expelling them from their countries. A total number of Germans who were expelled or departed voluntarily from Eastern Europe after the end of the war amounted to 11.5 million. There's a place called Königsberg, you may have heard of it. now called Kaliningrad. Königsberg was occupied by Germans for hundreds of years. It's the place where Immanuel Kant came from, and some of the greatest German philosophers and musicians. But then after the Second World War, the Russians expelled every single German from that country, and tens of thousands died on the ships that were sunk by the Russians as they tried to escape, and occupied the land by Russia. Anybody heard the Germans wanting it back? Lose a war, you lose land. Nearly 2 million Poles were compulsory transferred from eastern areas of Poland that had been annexed by the USSR, by Belarus. They took the place of Germans expelled from the formerly German regions of Pomerania and Silesia, now transferred to Poland. 500,000 Ukrainians, Belarusians and others were deported from Poland to the Soviet Union. That's the way it was. That's what happens. You lose a war, it's really messy. But you just have to say, okay, we lost, let's get on with life. Let's look forward. Let's not be full of resentment and try to get it all back again. Otherwise, it'll just be another war in Europe. You're trying to reverse the outcomes of the First and Second World Wars. So when the state of Israel was established then, 600,000 Jews were expelled and encouraged to leave Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Egypt, etc. They left behind houses, businesses and possessions. Now these Jews had been living in Iraq since the time of the Babylonian conquest, 3,000 years. But they were just, you don't belong here, this is not your home, we're kicking you out, this is only Arabs and Muslims are allowed to live here. And this is what happened. And they don't go around and say, well, 5 minutes, okay, we got a key to our old house, we want to have our old house back, we want to have our land back, our farm, we want to have our businesses back. It doesn't happen. They settled where they settled and they integrated into that society. 720,000 Palestinians, these are Arabs, Muslims, or Christians as well, who were living in that area. They fled to Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, West Bank, and to Gaza. But they were not given citizenship, but kept in refugee camps until today. So when these refugees went to Gaza and lived in refugee camps, that was part of Egypt. But Egypt didn't give them Egyptian citizenship, so they could go live in Cairo or Alexandria or get on with life. They were stuck in a refugee camp. And this is the same in all these Arab countries. They refused to give the Palestinians the right to citizenship, education, business, travel, and everything else. They were just stuck in these refugee camps. The Europeans didn't do that. And there are refugee camps in Europe today after the Second World War. The last ones were closed in the mid-60s. So, only Jordan welcomed Palestinians, granted them citizenship, and a lot of money was sent up to reset touch. Any discussion aimed at a solution to the Palestinian problem, which is not based on ensuring the refugees' right to annihilate Israel, will be regarded as desecration of the Arab people and act of treason. Anybody else go around thinking like that 50 years later, 70 years later? No, in Europe anyway. So Jews do not insist on a right to return to Arab countries from which they were expelled. They don't do that. You just say, okay, we lost. Move on.
What do you think, what has stopped people to learn from other cultures?
Why do people not learn from other countries?
Or other cultures, like Europe, for example?
Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. I mean, it just depends why they think the way that they think. And, you find sometimes people get consumed with resentment. I mean, if you're Scottish, during the independence referendum in Scotland, there was a huge amount of bitterness towards the English
Still.
about what happened a long, long time ago.
Yeah.
And the Irish as well. Can't forget Cromwell, etc. This stuff happens, and it's unfortunate when it does because it poisons the present. But it goes on and on, poison. Okay, so what should happen now? My opinion, God's providence. Every nation should be independent, including Israel should be an independent nation. In terms of Palestine, well, as I said, when Egypt when Gaza is part of Egypt, Egyptians should have decided how to manage that situation. It's desperately unfair for Egypt to refuse to take Gaza back and to expect Israel to administer it. Desperately unfair. Jordan should have taken the West Bank back, but didn't want to. It's desperately unfair to leave West Bank governed by Israel, Jews. Muslims can't accept it. It's unacceptable for Muslims to be governed by Jews. Well, that's the way it is. So that's why they should have taken these bits back. And Palestinian refugee camps should be given citizenship, assimilated. The idea of right of return should be abandoned. You can't just do that. Nobody else does that. Egypt should take back Gaza, as I said. Palestinians and other Muslims should not be brought up to hate Israel and Jews. And Jews in Israel should treat Arab Israelis and Palestinians with more respect than they do. Actually, Palestinians or Arabs living in Israel have got far more political and civil rights than Arabs in any Arab country. Change the narrative, which would be good. Unfortunately, the reality is it's been carried on. So Hamas and Hezbollah have been directed by Iran. We saw this invasion of a terrorist attack in Israel on October the 7th last year. And all you see on the media today is what's going on in Gaza. It looks awful. It is awful. But, and a lot of people get killed. And the numbers of people get killed gets reported. What is not reported is this. This is someone called Andrew Roberts. He's now a lord. He's one of the most eminent British historians and military historians. And so he said the Israeli Defense Forces killed fewer civilians per combatant, in other words, per other soldier, than any other army in the history of warfare. He put it speaking in Parliament, he said, war is hell. It is. And every individual civilian death is a tragedy. But, and I speak as a military historian, less than 2 to 1 is an astonishingly low ratio for modern urban warfare, where the terrorists routinely use civilians as human shields. It is a testament to the professionalism, ethics and values of the Israeli Defense Forces. So the media in this country, unfortunately, are very anti-Semitic, and most people are. But Father said, actually, this is the way it should be. Judaism, Christianity should unite, and unification should unite together. Because this is the way it is. God's side, Satan's side today. On the Abel side, with Israel, Christian world, South Korea. Cain's side, you've got Iran, Syria, Hamas, Hezbollah, China, and North Korea. And that's the problem. There should be unity of these three, which your father talked about in Washington Monument. Anyway, so I hope that's not too depressing. The future is very bleak, to be perfectly honest. With the current new government in this country, it's not very hopeful. Trump in America, I think it is much more hopeful. But I want to wish you all a Merry Christmas, which finishes on Epiphany, the 6th of July. Thank you. I'm glad somebody's listening. I knew it began with a J, I just got it wrong. And also wish you all a happy Hanukkah, one more day of Hanukkah left. And also wish you a happy New Year. As God says to Jeremiah, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future." And so that's the plan. But in order for that plan to come about, then we have to get involved in making that plan come about. And that's really important, this whole idea of unity of Judaism, Christianity, and unification. We really need to focus upon that, I think. Okay, thank you very much, and hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you.